Welcome back, class. Been a while, but let's get to it. Today's lecture: contribution of free blacks to the birth of the black church. Just a few things to go over real quick. Free blacks tended to congregate in urban areas, whether they were in the north or the south. Um, these urban areas um, allow blacks at least some level of economic opportunity, economic freedom, even in these urban areas. However, um, Tulsa or Greenwood, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street, when blacks were doing well economically, segregated from the white citizenry and participation in white businesses. Blacks would do their own thing and do extremely well, so well that, as I was saying, uh, Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Greenwood, Oklahoma, more specifically, um, was bombed, literally bombed. That was Black Wall Street. Um, because whites just did not want blacks to be economic competition. But that's a whole nother subject. Um, Black folk, free blacks, were a big part of their life, their existence. Of course, was the church. But one of the things that the church gave birth to was a thing called mutual aid societies, um, and these really started even before blacks were free. Um, it's it's the precursor to today's benevolence offerings in churches, where poor blacks would pitch their pennies together, pool their resources, and say one month Sister Sarah and her family were going through hard times, and the church would donate um, some portion of those funds to help her out. Maybe another month or two down the line, uh, due to a fire, arson, or whatever, someone lost their home, then those funds will be used there. But mutual aid societies began out of African people's desire to provide funeral services, homegoing services, celebrations of life for their relatives who had gone on. In the African context, in the African spiritual mindset, death was just um, a pathway to another part of one's existence. And so the whole ritual and ceremony of funerals, of sending people off, was critically important. However, it was difficult if you were enslaved and have no means by which to send your loved ones off in the right way, or the recently freed um, black folk in this country having little or nothing. And so the mutual aid societies were founded, number one, to help blacks out with that issue, but number two, to also come to the aid of widows and orphans. And so again, black folk pooling their resources, putting their money together to just try to help each other out. Um, but from that, the mutual aid societies just continued to grow and expand in terms of the services that they provided. And from the mutual aid societies, those gave birth to some of the first black businesses, mortuaries, insurance companies, schools, all sorts of things grew out of those mutual mutual aid societies. So those are really important when we're talking about the birth of the black church, free blacks. How did they get this done? The church, one. Number two, the mutual aid societies. All right, just some folk to remember when we're talking about the birth of the black church. Oh, excuse me. Well, the contributions of free blacks to the birth of the church. One name that we've already talked about. We'll talk about him again briefly. Denmark Vesey. Denmark Vesey was a brother who was free um, while black folk were still enslaved. Very devoutly spiritual, religious man. He taught Bible class at a local church. Was a church leader, but the church in which he taught um, on December 3rd of one particular year, I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but 469 people were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. Basically, it was black people having church and whites not trusting what they were doing. June of 1818, the church leadership was arrested, beaten, imprisoned, fined. Some of them were banished, run out of town. But this did not stop that particular church congregation from doing what they believed God called them to do. So after all this harassment, on and on and on, they came back together. Um, and while coming back together, Denmark teaching Bible class, focusing on the Old Testament, on those stories of liberation, of Hebrews calling out to God and God answering their call. He began to organize to try to get folk to join him on a revolt against the establishment of slavery. One person that he called to join his movement was a brother by the name of Gullah Jack, who practiced traditional African religion. And I think it's significant because it just shows the power of religious icons in our community, whether their beliefs are totally in sync with ours or not. And I think it shows how Denmark recognized how just that connection with African spirituality was important to the health of black folk at that time and any chance that they might have of success, of finally finding freedom. But those two I mentioned because both were free, yet both lived during a time of enslavement, but they were trying to help their sisters and brothers become free, and their religious beliefs were foundational to every decision that they made with that regard. Okay, I've already mentioned mutual aid societies. I'll just jump right to two names that you should remember: George Lau and Andrew Bryan. Both, depending on what book you read, are credited with founding the African Baptist Church of Savannah, Georgia, known as the oldest or the first black church in the United States, established in 1777. But George Lau, Andrew Bryan. George Lau founded that church, but he also did some missionary work in the islands, particularly in Jamaica. Andrew Bryan, persecuted, whipped, tortured for wanting to build his own church, yet finally allowed to do so. He has a long story where he preached to black and white congregations. He was permitted by his quote-unquote master to build a church, and was promised to have it was promised to him that he'd be able to have full control and ownership of the church, but Massa died, and then came a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, so to speak. And so Bryan was persecuted, whipped, tortured, beaten. Sounds like we're talking about 2015, but anyway. But he was finally allowed to conduct services in a barn, and he bought some land with the help of other sisters and brothers, purchased his freedom after Massa died. Like I said, there was all this hemming and hawing about whether he would be allowed to run that church or not, but he just persevered, and him and George Lau, the African Baptist Church, was born, the first black church. It's still in existence, so if you're ever in Savannah, go on a Sunday morning, go take time to go over there and worship. Another name to remember is Josiah Bishop. He was doing his ministry in Northampton, Virginia, and a lot of these folk were in that particular area, especially those who were leading quote-unquote slave revolts. Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, and so many were all in that same Northampton, Virginia area. I don't know what was in the water over there, but folk were sure wanting some freedom. But Josiah Bishop, he was a minister. He preached from New York to Baltimore, all over the place, but he finally became pastor of what has become one of the most famous black churches in the country. Yes, I am at my high school, so that's an announcement. Entering and exiting the building will be locked. Thank you and have a good day. Thank you very much. All right, like I was saying, Josiah Bishop became pastor of one of the most famous black churches in the United States, Abyssinian Baptist Church. It has a long and glorious history. It's still located right there in Harlem, New York. Some of the pastors, I'll just give you three names: Adam Clayton Powell Jr., very famous in civil rights movement. Both were pastors there. Floyd Flake was another. But Josiah Bishop, way back in the day, was a pastor there. And Josiah Bishop, he just brings to mind this whole notion of the conflict that existed over the status of the black preacher. And this is in the notes that are posted online, but I'll just go through it real quick. Always a question over the status of the black preacher and black congregants in relation to white church congregations. The schism in various national church organizations regarding slavery, slavery focused on the issue of the status of the black church and the white church. This led to splits in various white organizations. Blacks in the South continued to join the Methodist and Baptist churches in large numbers because those at the particular time were more open to blacks coming into their church. But some sections of the Methodist church and the Baptist church weren't so keen on worshiping with black folk. So you had splits within the Methodist church, splits within the Baptist church as well. The blacks in every phase, at every time, were always seeking more autonomy, more freedom, more control of their own religious life, which led to a person like Richard Allen, another name you need to remember. He's known as the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a Methodist preacher, purchased his freedom and his brother's freedom way back in the 1700s, became a preacher, officially in 1780. He was allowed to travel with white preachers, all throughout the then United States and preach. His base of operations was Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and while he was there, he tried to talk blacks into creating their own church, a church that they ran themselves completely. But the blacks there were not trying to hear him. The particular church he was at was St. George. But anyway, so at St. George, the blacks were segregated. They're in there worshiping. They're sitting in segregated seats. They can't pray in the same place that whites can pray. And so, just one particular day, I don't know if it was organized or just moved by the Spirit, but Richard Allen and his friend Absalom Jones decided to pray in the white section, in the white prayer section. But they were removed, thrown out of the church, and that incident, when they were drugged from, on their knees, just drugged out of the church and just thrown out while praying. It was then when the blacks that saw that, I guess, began to open their minds, say, hey, maybe we do need something that we own and control so we can treat each other with dignity and respect. But right after that incident, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones founded their own mutual aid society, and they called it the Free African Society. From that mutual aid society that they both founded together, it was then that they split off. They wanted to found a church. Allen was tied to the Methodist Church, while Absalom Jones was tied to the Episcopal faith. And so Jones organized and founded his own church, the African Protestant Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. Richard Allen founded a church with a much shorter title, Bethel Church. It was 1794, although I'm not going to hold you responsible for dates. But after Bethel Church was founded, there were churches all along the eastern seaboard that followed that same formula or that same foundation. And so years later, in 1816, all these different churches from Philadelphia, Ohio, New York, and all other parts close to that area, they came together in a confab or a synod, and that is where they formally founded and established the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And it was there they elected Richard Allen as their bishop. Significant because you had black people not seeking or waiting on white approval to form their own church, and not seeking or waiting on white approval to elect Richard Allen as a bishop. So that was kind of revolutionary at that particular time. But Richard Allen, the AME Church, the late 1790s. Down south, you had this same movement going on. It just happened a little later, around the 1870s, a lot later. But the Methodist Episcopal Church, you had a lot of blacks in the South that were part of that church, but they had the same desire to have autonomy and control, be self-determining about their lives, about their spiritual lives, and every other part of their lives. And so in 1870 in Jackson, Tennessee, black folk moved away from the Methodist Episcopal Church and founded what they called the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, the CME Church. The CME Church, which denomination is still alive, they just don't call themselves the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church today. Today they're called the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. But just a taste of this desire that black people had always had, all people have, for autonomy, self-determination, to be in charge of your own life without having to answer to someone else. And so it's just significant in terms of black church history. So please remember those names: Denmark Vesey, who we mentioned before, George Lau, Andrew Bryan, Josiah Bishop, Absalom Jones, and of course Richard Allen, Bishop Richard Allen. All right, that's that.